The Tom Woods Show, episode 2336.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey, everybody. As the academic year winds down, it's time to start thinking about what you're going to do in the fall. And of course, I highly recommend the self-taught K through 12 Ron Paul curriculum. Not only will your kids get the real story about everything, but they'll also learn the kinds of practical things that they won't learn in the traditional school. For instance, how to be an effective public speaker, how to manage money, and how to run your own home business. And of course, when they reach the high school grades, they will be learning Western civilization and U.S. government from old Tom Woods here. But here's the most important thing. If you're going to join, make sure you join through my link, because only through my link do you get $160 worth of free bonuses. My link is ronpaulhomeschool.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. I'm so happy to have Germinal G Van back on the show. And I want to talk about material from the second volume of his massive work on the history of wealth distribution in the United States. And as a matter of fact, is that the title?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right. You all know at this point about our friend Germinal and the many books he has written, I believe. And what tends to happen is in between appearances on the show, he writes a new book. But he's been up to some other things in the meantime. He has his own publishing company now, and you have your own economic and financial commentary website. You want to say something about that?
Yes, so it's a news organization company. Yes, so we focus basically on financial markets, economics, business, and politics between the United States and Africa. So the main goal is to expose Americans to African capital markets so that if they're interested in investing into emerging markets, the African markets could be a good way to invest. So for those who are more curious, instead of going to the Asian markets, they can try the African capital markets because they're corporations, they have stock exchanges there, there are opportunities to increase their profit and their portfolio as well. So that is why I created this platform to give Americans an exposure to African capital markets.
So what's the website?
It's called the Lake Street Review, the lakestreetreview.com.
Okay. Is it just lakestreetreview.com without the?
It's just Lake Street Review. This is the actual title. And the website is www.lakestreetreview.com.
All right. I'll link to that also at tomwoods.com/2336. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about in the second volume. Let's see what we get to. I've picked out a few topics that I think are of interest. I think by and large, people get that in the 1920s, the two presidents we associate with that decade were known for lowering the income tax rates that prevailed during World War I and for lowering the spending levels that prevailed during World War I with the war over. But what they may know less about, or maybe they have, I don't know, a rough idea about it, but they don't really have any details, a lot of people, is the 1930s. Or let's say starting with the end of 1929 for obvious reasons. And the person and thinking of Herbert Hoover, because as you know, there is a bit of a caricature that there's supposed to be a wild and dramatic difference in philosophy, governing philosophy between Herbert Hoover and his successor, Franklin Roosevelt. And Herbert Hoover was the devotee of extreme laissez-faire economics, whereas Franklin Roosevelt was the wise statesman who understood that we need to set aside the free market in order to bring about other social goals that we value apart from just economic freedom. So let's start with Hoover. How true is this?
It's not true at all. I used to believe that myself until I've done more research.
I think we all did. Everybody in school taught us that. What were we supposed to think?
I think it's because Herbert Hoover was a Republican. And in the American political landscape, we tend to associate Republicanism or the Republican Party with laissez-faire free market economics. But it's not always the case. And Herbert Hoover is the perfect epitome of that disconnection. In fact, Herbert Hoover was a huge proponent of government intervention. And the policies that he implemented to address the Great Depression exacerbated the problem rather than solving them. So he tried basically to increase taxes. That didn't work. And it was when FDR came that he applied the budget deficit. He did massive deficit to bring back unemployment, but I'll talk about that in a second. But what Herbert Hoover did was to try to raise taxes in order to stimulate the economy, but that didn't work. And he created a bunch of programs as well that exacerbated the problem. So Herbert Hoover did genuinely believe in government intervention. He didn't believe in the market like that. Sure, like he may believe in private property because he had a business career prior to entering politics, but his true political ideology leans with the government supervising, even interfering in market mechanism to quote unquote make it more efficient. But on the contrary, he completely distorted the market. And when we look at all the data, we see that unemployment completely increased, real income decreased substantially. Then all the other economic indicators that were supposed to be positive went all in red territories, as we say.
There was a member, maybe it was Rexford Tugwell, was a member of the so-called brain trust of FDR, who later said that what we established in the New Deal was really just an extrapolation from what Hoover had begun during his term.
Yeah.
And so Hoover had begun to interfere with agriculture or had tried various means to prop wages up at a time when demand for labor was falling. So not really an ideal time to do that. Also, substantial spending on public works, which I think people think he didn't do. He absolutely did do. He spent more in 4 years on public works than had been spent in the previous 20. And in fact, we'll recall too that in the campaign of 1932, the vice presidential nominee of Franklin Roosevelt said that Hoover is taking us down the road to socialism, and FDR talked about his budgets. So you could be forgiven for thinking, yeah, there is a difference between the two tickets. One wants to intervene in the economy, and the other, we're not so sure, but is critical of somebody who wants to intervene in the economy. Then as soon as FDR takes power, all that stuff about worrying about budgets or socialism or whatever goes right out the window. Mm-hmm. But one of the best known statements by Hoover right at the end is from his own recollections of what happened. He said, "We might have done nothing. That would have been utter ruin. Instead, we met the situation with proposals to private business and to Congress of the most gigantic program of economic defense and counterattack ever evolved in the history of the Republic." And we should also remember, too, that in the 1920s, before he was president, he was Commerce Secretary under Harding. Mm-hmm. He said repeatedly, laissez-faire is dead. He kind of imagined more of a public-private partnership, but that laissez-faire was dead. So the caricature of Hoover is just a creation of seventh grade teachers everywhere, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, it's very true because, as I was saying, he did not believe in laissez-faire at all. Like, it was not his primary political belief. When you look at the crisis in the early 1920s, Harding didn't do anything. People were even saying that he was getting drunk instead of addressing economic issues. But Harding just let the market do its work, and the economy recovered pretty fast. And then we got into what we call the Roaring 20s, where like life in the United States was becoming better and better. Like the United States, it was becoming the first power due to its high living standard. So that was because Harding believed that it is better to leave the market alone because people will eventually find a way to make things work. And it always does. But when you're trying to interfere in the economy because you believe that you know better than the market does, the only thing you're doing is delaying what is supposed to happen earlier. Because of doing or implementing artificial means to fix things, you're delaying a problem. And as you're delaying that problem, when that problem actually happens, it's going to be 10 times worse than how it was supposed to happen initially. And this is what we are seeing with FDR and Truman and all the presidents that come after him, and basically the economy in general. And things got even worse under Lyndon Johnson, but I believe we'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah, we'll try and get to that in a little while. So in this summary that we're doing of this period of history that most people misunderstand only because they're given the wrong information, frankly, in school, FDR takes over and people say that, well, you know what's interesting actually over time, Germinal, is that it used to be that Franklin Roosevelt was successful. But then the fact is, you just cannot overlook that the unemployment figures were still bad throughout the 1930s. They were way higher than they should have been. And so now you get basically stenographers of the regime like Doris Kearns Goodwin saying things like, well, the important thing is that he gave us hope. He might not have solved the problem, but he gave us hope. And I have a friend who says, look, if you fell down a well and somebody shouted down at you, we're sending a ladder down, just hang tight, we're going to send a ladder, and you get a little impatient. Where's the ladder? Don't worry, the ladder's coming. And that gives you hope. But there is no ladder. Then is that guy really helping you? So just telling me that he gave us hope doesn't really cut it. And as you say, like normal production isn't actually resuming until like the 1940s. So what's going on? What are some things that FDR does that you think are maybe counterproductive?
So he basically applied all the principles of John Maynard Keynes. Keynes believed that the way to recover an economy that has been experiencing a recession is to apply massive budget deficits. So budget deficit means that you're spending more than you generate revenues. So when you have a budget deficit, it creates more debt because, of course, debt is not free. You have to pay back the debt. So what it means is that whatever people are producing, the wealth, so the goods and servicing that people are producing, will only be used to compensate for that debt that has to be paid. It's not used to actually go to people's pockets. It's not the fruit of the labor that they will be enjoying. It's like taking a loan at a bank and every paycheck you get is to pay back the loan instead of living. So it was the same. And that's how it has been since FDR. And it even got worse in the 60s and 70s. But FDR started that concept, the concept of the credit-based economy, because the credit-based economy favors government spending. Because prior to that, as you know, government was not really that involved. I mean, sure, it got to start getting involved more under Hoover, but prior to Hoover, it was not really involved in the economy. But when FDR took power, he made government the epicenter of all human activities. So what he's trying to do is to tell Americans that government is your friend. You can rely on government to do X, Y, Z. And the reason why, on that note, FDR was successful in terms of making Americans believe that government is their friend is because that's what Americans wanted to believe either. They wanted to have a strong leader who would project that strength. So the circumstances of the time favored FDR. And FDR then used that opportunity to create a ton of government programs that will basically control all aspects, all economic sectors. He even increased taxes on very basic things like gums, drinks, and stuff like that as a means of trying to create revenue. But what FDR did by creating massive deficit to bring unemployment back is that it was the future generations that will have to pay the debt on those deficits created. And that is the problem. And if we look at the data for government spending and budget deficit, it kept increasing over time. And this is the doing of FDR. So I don't think it did a favor to the Americans. In the short term, sure, okay, it perhaps helped the country get over the depression, but it was not done naturally. It was not based on an organic mechanism like the market. It was artificially done by some people call themselves experts who believe that they know more than everyone else and they have the solution to everything. But in my opinion, their solution only exacerbates the problem, that it creates a financial hole that the United States cannot get out of it because we keep borrowing, we keep taking on debt, we keep creating budget deficit. For government, it works because they're spending money that is not theirs. So politicians love spending money. But for the private sector, for people like you and I who are creating goods and services every single day, we are the one losing because a substantial portion of what we are creating is taken by force to compensate for that debt that has to be repaid.
We also have to bear in mind a couple things here in the big picture, that the economy has always turned around, whether there was intervention or not. So when there were downturns before the New Deal, it turned around on its own. So the presumption is that the economy will turn around on its own. We're not in a permanent depression from like 1873 or something. It turned around on its own. And likewise, the downturn of 1920 to 21, that basically turned around on its own. So the presumption is that it's going to turn around on its own. And David Stockman from the Reagan administration says that if you look at the numbers at the end, the very tail end of the Hoover term, it looks like things are starting to turn around already. And then FDR kind of rides that wave. But the presumption is that the economy has certain mechanisms by which it readjusts. Things get repriced, wages get reset to the point where profitability is restored, and then the economy continues. The other thing is the kinds of things he did. Now, so I think your answer is really good because the biggest legacy of the New Deal, apart from programs like Social Security, obviously, is not so much the individual programs as it is the overall philosophy behind it and the overall approach, because that is the thing that has stuck with us. I mean, we may not have every single aspect of the old Agricultural Adjustment Act or the Public Works Administration and all that. We might not have those specifics anymore, but what we do have is FDR's approach to governing, approach to the economy, his thinking on the market versus the government. That's the stuff that persists.
Yeah. FDR believed that we cannot achieve the common good without government. So to him, government is this organization in which people become one. So what he forgets though, and that's where I make a link between his approach and the socialist Marxian approach, is that when they talk about society, they always tend to ignore that society is simply a bunch of people. It's just individuals. It's just an aggregate of people. Society is not something on its own. It's not like a unit independent of human beings. It's just an aggregate of human beings. What makes up society is human beings pursuing the self-interest. And it's by pursuing the self-interest that they indirectly contribute to society's advancement. That's what Adam Smith talked about in The Wealth of Nations. But FDR, he believes that when you are part of a group, your desires, basically anything that is related to the individual, is no longer relevant. What is relevant is the collective. So the collective has a precedent over the individual. So whatever you do, whatever you think about, it has to be toward the collective. It has to pertain to the benefit of the collective. And that's how FDR saw the United States. To him, it was the American society was a big, gigantic organism. It was like a big, gigantic organic structure that has nothing to do with individuals. And that's where I believe he's wrong, because if you do not take into account people's desires, people's values, people's self-interest, you will not be able to optimize the common good, because the common good is when you aggregate everything, but you have to take into consideration, you need to take the micro part, because everyone is different from one another. It's because we're pursuing different things that eventually, when we add all of that, it creates something better. But if you start taking people as uniform, everyone thinks the same way, everyone does the same thing, it doesn't lead to the common good as the left tried to think that it does. And this is a real legacy of FDR. That's what he successfully did. He successfully shaped the essence of liberalism in America. Today, when we talk about liberalism, we talk about social liberalism. So liberalism in which the government is heavily involved. So FDR tried to create a balance between equality and individual liberty, but there is no balance. When you try to combine the two, equality will always take precedent over individual liberty, because if equality is at stake, FDR will not hesitate to sacrifice individual liberty to achieve equality. And that's exactly what he did during his terms as president. And that's what every Democratic president, even some Republicans, did along the way. They tried to combine the two, and they said, well, we'd rather have equality over individual freedom. I mean, thank God Reagan didn't do that, but most presidents did. And by doing that, they start to sacrifice the individual for the collective. And I think that's where the United States went into the wrong path.
I'm going to post at tomwoods.com/2336 one or two old episodes where I actually do go through each program. We look at the specifics of it, but for people who want to get more information on that, because I do want to try to take a little time to fast forward all the way to the 1960s, because this is another transformative moment in American history, namely with the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson. And there's been a lot of controversy about those programs ever since, about whether they did more harm than good, whether they had, quote, unintended consequences. I hear you when you say things like, Lyndon Johnson had noble intentions, but they just went wrong. When I was a young pup like you, Germinal, I used to think that way, that they always mean well, and yet mysteriously, everything goes wrong. After a while, you have to wonder, either they are the most incompetent people on earth, which I don't rule out that possibility, or maybe the unintended consequences aren't so unintended. Maybe making people dependent on the regime is what they wanted. Maybe that was the outcome they wanted. Am I too cynical? You think I'm too cynical?
No, I don't think you're too cynical, because the thing is that government is as well an actor in the economy. It's no longer this referee that was just passive and watching. Government became very active. So if you're an actor, if you're very active into something, you will try to get the advantage. You'll try to get the advantage of the situation. And that's what government did. But what LBJ trying to do is I think personally he was kind of cynical to some extent. Here is why. He tried to mix feelings with economics. Economics is not about feelings. And people always do this with compassionate economics. What does it mean, compassionate economics? It doesn't mean anything. It's not about compassion. Let me give you an example, right? We see, for example, a woman like Kim Kardashian, who is a billionaire. Personally, this is just my opinion. I don't think she brings any real value. And yet, the market liked this woman for some reason that I really can't understand. I've tried to understand the rationale behind why people are so obsessed with her, but they are, right? This is here not a matter of, it's just what people want. And to come back to LBJ, he tried, for example, when we look at student loans, people complain about the fact that education in America became extremely expensive. Yes, it is expensive when you grant loans to everyone, not just to certain people who are studying practical things, because you know that once they get onto the labor market, they will be able to get a job and they will be able to pay back the loans. No, the government is giving loans to everyone and they can study whatever they want, even the most useless degrees. And that decision was made under the premise that everyone deserves an education. Education is a right. Education is not a right, it's a service. Because the people who are giving you those lectures, the people who are teaching you, they have to be paid too. So if you make education a right, it means that it is by default free. So that will increase demand. So everyone wants now to go to college, but there is not enough to supply to everyone. So I don't know if Lyndon Johnson didn't take any course of economics at all, or if he deliberately do it, but he completely missed the point about scarcity. And he did that with food stamps. He did that with housing. Like if you look at every program in the Great Society, it's always the same. It's about quote unquote compassion to give it to the poor, because you want to give it to the poor, so you start increasing demand. But if you want to increase demand, you have to make sure that supply follows up too. If your supply doesn't follow up, what do you have? You have inflation. That's what happens. And that's what LBJ did. Every program he created, he did not understand that both have to follow each other, but he increased demand, neglect supply, and eventually the price of everything rose. And that's what we have today. And for example, Nixon, instead of trying to undo whatever LBJ did, he kind of continued what LBJ did. And no president, even on this one, I have to accuse Reagan a little bit, because no president dared to touch the welfare state. Because if they touch the welfare state, they will not be reelected. So here they start to prioritize their political agenda, their political gain over the sanity of American society. And to me, this is where the real issue is doing this compassion economics. And I think that there was a book recently wrote about Janet Yellen. and it's called compassionate economics. I was like, here we go again, the same garbage. Like, what does it mean? Compassionate economics. There's no compassion. It's just the market. You don't bring compassion in the market. If people want something, they're going to buy what you're producing. If they're not buying what you're producing, perhaps they don't like what you're doing. Simple as that.
I think the other big picture thing that changes in large part with LBJ is that the stated intentions of something are sufficient for a lot of people. They hear, oh, they're going to improve education. That's great. And then they don't follow up. Did it improve education? Or they're going to create jobs for people who are down and out. That's great. And then they don't follow up on it. So if something is called the Create Jobs program, people think, oh, that's awesome. And they don't bother to see what actually wound up happening. So LBJ spent billions of dollars to improve the education of poor kids. But by the late 70s, when a study was actually done on it, they found that whatever gains these poor kids had, whatever paltry gains they had one year, had completely dissipated by the following year. They found the same thing with the Head Start program. But I specifically remember being a professor and teaching young, basically freshmen, U.S. history. And I gave the example of the Job Corps. And this was supposed to take disadvantaged kids and bring them out away from the influence of the city and bring them elsewhere and to train them and get them employed in a way that would give them a good start in life. And that sounds great. Why not do that, right? We're going to get people jobs. But it turned out that it just didn't work. First of all, it cost about as much, would have cost the same amount to send them to Harvard for a year as it did to enroll them in the Job Corps. But the thing is, 2/3 of them, this is a free job training program. 2/3 of them didn't even bother to complete it. So maybe we've realized why they're having trouble finding a job. You give them a free job training program, they won't even do that. Or they found out that 12% of people finishing the Job Corps program ended up finding work in the field they'd been trained for. Only 44% of them found any job, and their average hourly wage was, let's just say, pretty darn low. So the reason I bring this up is I had students say to me, one student in particular say, well, if the program didn't work, why did they keep it? And I thought, you poor, naive soul. The program worked in the sense that it got votes for politicians.
Yep.
Because they could say, hey, I am helping because I've created this job program, and nobody follows up on it. So it just gets them votes. And, it employs some people. As I say, it gives the impression that they're, quote, doing something. So it satisfies the requirements from a politician's point of view, but not from the point of view of somebody who cares about being careful with funds, let's say.
Yeah. And this is because the funds they're getting is not theirs. As Milton Friedman always said, like, you will always carelessly spend someone's money. But if it was your own money, maybe you think twice about how you're going to spend it. And that's how politicians are, because the funds allocated to them for whatever project, it's not theirs. And they know it's not theirs. So there's no consequences. And plus, the political body is not motivated by profit. They're motivated by the expansion of political power. And the expansion of political power is the most efficient when a policy doesn't work. Because in the private sector, when you run a business like I do, profit is a requirement. If you understand business, you have to make profit. And that's the end goal. But when you're in government, you create a program or you pass a legislation, you create a program, and for some reason, the program is inefficient. And since the program is inefficient, the politician is going to come and ask for more money, say, hey, like, we tried, but this happened, that happened. That's why it didn't work. So we're underfunded. We have a lack of resources. Therefore, we need to increase the budget so that we can do a better work. So what does it mean? We have to increase taxes. If they can collect enough taxes, they're going to go ask the central bank to print more money for them so that they can do it. So in either case, we are losing as a taxpayer. If they increase taxes, they're taking more from our paycheck. If they go and ask the money from the central bank, there is the hidden tax, inflation taking over, which is going to decrease our purchasing power. So in either case, we're losing. And the more a policy doesn't work, the better it is for the politician to implement new rules, new laws, new legislation on that policy to make it work. It's like technically doing CPR or something that doesn't work and expecting that this time it will work while adding the very same thing that you previously did and it didn't work. That's how politicians do. So the more a policy doesn't work, the better for them, so that they can implement laws on those things that affect us but doesn't affect them directly. So I think like it's really unfair, because for us who are in the private sector, running businesses, creating wealth, like this is hard work, this is real work. If you don't work, you don't eat. That's the private sector. But in the public sector, even their salaries is based on our taxes. Everything they do, the public sector doesn't create anything on its own. That's the problem. And whatever they do is to increase their power, because at the end of the day, government is run by individuals who have the self-interest like the people in the private sectors. The self-interest is not different, but the difference is how they increase, how they gain their power. In the private sector, you pursue your self-interest, you're doing well, you become wealthy. In the public sector, you pursue your self-interest, you gain more power by impoverishing others. It's rent-seeking.
Hey, folks, with Father's Day coming up, I got a message for you from Omaha Steaks. On Father's Day, your father and a bunch of other fathers are going to compare notes, and they're going to say, what did you get for Father's Day? And one of them will say, oh, I got a number one dad t-shirt. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's very, very sweet and nice. But he has 10 of them from the 10 previous Father's Days. Why don't you get him a countercultural, awesome gift that he secretly wants, and that will make him the envy of all the other dads? Your father or father-in-law or whoever is going to say, I got a hand-selected package from Omaha Steaks. You go over to omahasteaks.com, use promo code WOODS at checkout, you get $30 off your qualifying order. These packages can include bacon-wrapped filet mignons, air-chilled boneless chicken breasts, burgers, jumbo franks, many more favorites. I've been eating them myself because Omaha Steaks sent me an amazing package just like the kind that you can make for your own dad, and it's delicious as always. I've been ordering Omaha Steaks since maybe 2010. It's super convenient, top quality, and a great value. Well, whether he's your father, father-in-law, or father figure, he's the guy who was always ready to step up when you needed him most. This Father's Day, show him the love with the only gift that's as unforgettable as he is, the mouth-watering perfection of Omaha Steaks. From perfectly aged, oh-so-tender steaks to hand-selected gift packages, Omaha Steaks makes it easy to give Dad what he really wants. Order today and get $30 off with promo code WOODS. And every purchase is backed by their unconditional money-back guarantee. That's omahasteaks.com, promo code WOODS. Minimum order may be required. See site for details. I want to read a couple of passages. Let's do them one at a time. From Charles Murray, talking about the 1960s, and just get your thoughts on them. Now, the first one, his comment about drugs, I can see people having a little bit of pushback, but it's not really his central point. So he says this, summing up the effects of everything that happened in the 60s, from welfare payments to the approach to crime, education, all this stuff. He says, all the changes in the incentives pointed in the same direction. It was easier to get along without a job. It was easier for a man to have a baby without being responsible for it, for a woman to have a baby without having a husband. It was easier to get away with crime. Because it was easier for others to get away with crime, it was easy to obtain drugs. Because it was easier to get away with crime, it was easier to support a drug habit. Because it was easier to get along without a job, it was easier to ignore education. Because it was easier to get along without a job, it was easier to walk away from a job and thereby accumulate a record as an unreliable employee. Okay, in fact, hold that. And then I think I'm going to just read the other passage. He was saying that the other thing that really took hold in the 60s is the idea of welfare rights. The idea that this isn't like charity people are giving you. You have a right to these payments. And this undermined what Murray called status rewards, which that is to say, if you're a working poor family, one thing at least you had was the dignity of knowing you're not being a burden to your neighbors who are also poor. You're supporting yourself. But now this just seems foolish. And so here's the second passage. Once these highly functional sources of status are removed, the vaunted work ethic becomes highly vulnerable. The notion that there is an intrinsic good in working, even if one does not have to, may have impressive philosophical credentials, but on its face it is not very plausible, at least not to a young person whose values are still being formed. To someone who is not yet persuaded of the satisfactions of making one's own way, there is something laughable about a person who doggedly keeps working at a lousy job for no tangible reason at all. And when working no longer provides either income or status, the last reason for working has truly vanished. The man who keeps working is, in fact, a chump. What do you think?
Well, I think he says pretty much everything that I've been thinking about. Like, he basically stated my point. The 1960s was basically rewarding counterproductive habits. That's really what it was. It was encouraging and rewarding counterproductive habits. It's basically throwing away personal responsibilities. One of the core foundations on which this country was built. This country was built on freedom and personal responsibility. You cannot have one without the other. If you want to be free, you have to be responsible because freedom comes at a price. But under LBJ and the welfare state, because when he claims that something is all right, and this is something that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have been doing too, like using words, oh, healthcare is a right, education is a right. No, none of them are right. Like welfare is not a right because for you to be fed on welfare, someone has to work and they have to take from his paycheck and allocate the funds from his paycheck to the welfare program created just so that you can eat while you're, I would assume, a able-bodied person. And even for people who are disabled, same thing. Like there are always ways to do things in a private fashion to accommodate everyone. But by using people's resources as a government to feed everyone else, you're simply encouraging laziness. You're encouraging the lack of personal responsibility because the person who is on the welfare doesn't see any reason for him or her to work if that person will make $500 or $700 per month just for sitting at home. That person has no incentive to go look for a job because it's like, oh, well, I know that I'm going to get my paycheck coming. And sometimes those people get even irritated when they don't get their paycheck on time. I'm like, who the hell are you, man? Like, what the hell are you doing for you to have the right to get irritated? It's not your money. You are getting this paycheck because someone is waking up at 4:30 or 5 in the morning, commuting for like an hour to go work and finish work, not even at 5, but at 6 or 7. That's how it is. And that's what the Johnson government did. It's basically legalizing, permitting, and encouraging the lack of personal responsibility. It's encouraging social decadence, I will say. And that's what we're having today. Like today, if a politician come and say, let's repeal the welfare state, that will never get elected. Never. Because first of all, for the people who are on welfare, they will never vote for you. And for the so-and-so compassionate want to portray themselves as they're not bad people, they will support this nonsense so that they can stay in power or they can, quote unquote, preserve their reputation as a good person. So that's what it is. Like, and this is the legacy of Lyndon Johnson. It's basically promoting and encouraging counterproductive habits and the lack of personal responsibility.
All right, let's wrap up with this. You wrote 2 volumes on the general subject of wealth distribution in the U.S., and you studied government policy and how it changed over the decades and all the various factors that might go into this. What kind of general conclusions do you draw from this study?
That's a very good question. So the conclusion I will draw from this study is that in capitalism, the inequality we have when there is no government intervention or any of that sort, the inequality we have is normal. More importantly, I will say that the reason why we have inequality and most people are not at the same level is because a lot of people don't have financial education. People here are working, making good money. You have people who make 100,000, 200, or even 250,000 a year, but they're living paycheck to paycheck because they lack financial education. And they're accusing the rich of exploiting the system to manipulate the system to make it work in their favor. But that's not the case. The rich are rich because they own assets. It's simple as that. If you live in a market economy and you don't own assets, you're on the losing hand. You will be broke eventually. You'll be poor because you can't live off your salary. It's not enough. You have to own assets. And people who own assets understood that. The proof, when they own assets, they never sell it. They use it as collateral to take loans. When you look at very rich people like Elon Musk, that's what they do. Not even Elon Musk. Like if we take people who are in the 1%, people who are making $400,000 or $500,000 and they have assets, that's what they do. So it's about financial education. And many Americans are not financially educated. And it's because we live in this credit-based system in which we are incentivizing people to buy now and to pay later. It's that credit mentality. You can buy as much as you want, but they don't tell people that you have to pay that thing you're buying later, and there is interest on that payment you have to make. And people are getting into debt, and it doesn't end. But for banks, for the system that relies on fiat money, this is perfect, right? It is perfect. But if we had like gold, for example, or any type of commodity to back the value of money, people would not be taking debts like the way they do. So the inequality we are experiencing today in the United States, in my opinion, and based on the study I conducted, was engineered by the political body. That's what I see. Because when I see inequality, especially at the time of the Gilded Age, for example, that inequality was genuine. Because at the time, government spending was not even 5%. So all the goods and services produced were produced by the market. So as a result, although there was inequality, yes, but even the poorest people in the country had a better living standard than the poorest people in Europe. When we compare income to income, American income was much higher than income in the UK, in France, in Germany, or any other European country, because we were producing genuine wealth. But the government, since 1929, started taking control of human life in America and try to equilibrate things, try to fight inequality as if inequality was a bad thing. Inequality is not a bad thing. We cannot be equal. No matter how much we try, we cannot be equal. As I've always said, you can give people the exact same resources. They will still reach two different outcomes because everything depends on how you manage your resources. And the management of your resources depends on the education, the financial education you have. If you're not financially educated, we can give you $1 billion, you're still going to be broke because you're going to blow that $1 billion away. But if you're financially educated, you will turn that $1 billion to 2 billion, 3 billion, and so on and so forth. So that's what my conclusion is financial education. Is that because I think that people who are middle class can move through the upper class. And what politicians have tried to make people believe is that you cannot. If you're into a certain income bracket, you're stuck there. And that's not true. People move always from one income bracket to another. But it's important for people to know how to maintain themselves in there. And that's why one way to do that, as I said, is to own assets. Because if you just have your salary, you're one step away from poverty. No matter how much you make, you can lose that anytime. But if you own assets, you own capital, you can rely on that capital to sustain yourself because you're generating dividends and you're generating income through dividend or royalties or whatever, independent of your effort. So yeah, so that's what I'll have to say.
All right, let's see. I'm going to have links, the Lake Street Review, Germinal G Van Publishing Company. I have that linked at tomwoods.com/2336, but also links to the 2 volumes, A History of Wealth Distribution in the United States, from colonial times to the modern era. All of this will be up at tomwoods.com/2336. Well, continued good luck. I suppose all the things you have that you're balancing now are slowing the release of new books, but I know that the way a writer works until he reaches burnout is that he's always got something in the back of his mind he wishes he could be doing.
Always.
So do you mind telling me?
I was planning on working on a new book very soon. And this one, I think it will be more a work of political philosophy. And it's about the philosophy of American progressivism. I know Rothbard wrote a book about it already, about the progressive era. But I want to talk about progressivism today in the United States with woke culture and the social the generation that we're experiencing, like, why are we in such social turmoil? So this is what I want to explain. And since I like dealing with fundamentals, I think it's important to understand the core fundamental principles of progressivism in America, like modern liberalism. So that's what I want to do. So I don't know when that book will come out, but it will surely come out this year. I mean, that is a fact. But this is the first time I have to admit that since January, I haven't written a book. But there's a plan. There's always a plan. And it's also because I've been working with other authors and their work has priority over mine, because once they send their work, I have to start working on it and deliver the product before.
Right. So understandable. I'm glad everything's going well, and I appreciate the conversation today. You always have a home here to have a conversation when there's something new going on or a new book or whatever's going on. You have a welcome microphone here on the Tom Woods Show. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of the Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.